My name is Mark, and for 19 years, my life's work has been a ghost story told in kilobytes and forum threads. I've documented the Rake since the first whispers appeared on a fringe paranormal board back in 2005. I archived every alleged sighting, every hushed testimony, every terrified deletion. I was the silent librarian for a monster made of pixels and paranoia, a safe obsession that kept the real world at arm's length. But my role as an observer is over. Last night, the ghost story came to my door. This isn't a confession about what I've seen. It's a warning about what I've done. I'm going to tell you exactly how I built a home for a nightmare, and why it now refuses to leave. Stay with me, and you'll understand why some things should be allowed to be forgotten. My credibility isn't built on campfire tales. It's built on data. I'm a digital archivist, living alone in a small, isolated house on the rural outskirts of Bend, Oregon. My property line simply dissolves into the vast, dark expanse of the Deschutes National Forest. My world isn't one of misty clearings and strange howls. It's the low, constant hum of server racks in my basement office, the specific, dry scent of dust on warm electronics, and the rhythmic clack of my mechanical keyboard. My professional life is managing enterprise-level data for a company you've probably heard of. My private life, my real life, is curating the data of a single, impossible entity. It was an arrangement that worked, a system that had perfect, logical order. The hum was my world. That low, steady vibration from the servers wasn't just background noise, it was a wall of sound and logic that kept everything else out. For years, it was the only thing I needed. It was my companion, my focus, my reason for staying up until 3 in the morning. Meticulously cross-referencing file dates and IP addresses from posts made over a decade ago. Every click of the keyboard, every whir of a cooling fan, was a brick in the fortress I had built around myself. A fortress of information, where I was the king and the sole inhabitant. It was a kingdom of one, and I believed, for a very long time, that it was all I would ever need. It was a way to channel the grief. You see, the isolation. My partner Sarah left me years ago. The night she packed her bags, her final words weren't angry. They were just tired. She told me I was more in love with the shadows on my screen than I was with her. She said I was living in a mausoleum of dead information, and she couldn't breathe the dust anymore. She was right. After she was gone, the silence in the house was unbearable, so I filled it. I bought more servers, bigger hard drives. The hum got louder. The hum was my world, and it was a world built specifically so I would never have to feel that kind of silence again. My collection was comprehensive. While others shared blurry photos and wrote panicked, misspelled accounts that would be deleted hours later, I saved them. I had a private, encrypted network where every single mention of the creature was stored, catalogued, and preserved. The original 4chan post from 2005, the Mariner's log from 1880, that was retroactively linked to it. The Spanish journal entry from the 12th century. I had audio files, corrupted video snippets, transcripts of emergency calls, and screenshots of forum threads that no longer existed. I wasn't a believer or a debunker. I was an archivist. My duty was to the data itself, to protect the signal from the noise. That was my mantra. The noise became the signal last night. I was doing routine maintenance, cleaning up a corrupted audio file from a 2008 post. It was a classic of the genre, supposed recording of the creature, captured by a deer hunter's microphone, left running overnight. I'd heard it 100 times, analyzing its waveform, trying to filter out the static. It was just another piece of data, another byte in the ghost's digital body. I was in my basement office, the house completely dark except for the glow of my 3 monitors and the blinking server lights. It was a night like any other. The hum was steady. The world outside didn't exist. I put on my studio-grade headphones to isolate the sound, hoping to finally pull something clean from the corrupted file. The recording played its signature mix, a bed of low-frequency static, almost a subsonic hum, and then the sound itself, a strange, wet, chittering click. It's an unforgettable sound once you've heard it, something between insect and reptile, but with a dry, bony resonance to it. It's the sound that haunted the comments sections for years. The sound that people claimed to hear right before the connection was lost. It was familiar. It was safe. It was just a file. Then it happened. Through the thick padding of my headphones, I heard it again, but not from the file. This sound was crisp, immediate, and coming from outside, from the woods, just beyond my back deck. It was the exact same sound, the wet, chittering click. Not an echo, not a coincidence. It was a reply. My blood went cold. I ripped the headphones from my ears, and the sound of my own frantic heartbeat filled my head. The digital artifact I had spent years curating, the ghost in the machine, was in my backyard. It was real, and it was answering me. And then came the silence. The hum of the servers in the basement suddenly seemed impossibly loud, because everything else had just stopped. The chirping of the crickets, the rustle of leaves in the night breeze, the distant call of an owl I'd grown accustomed to, all of it gone. It was a silence so profound, so absolute, it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. It was the kind of unnatural quiet that signifies a predator in the tall grass. A suffocating, expectant silence that says everything is holding its breath. Waiting, the forest knew it was there. And now, so did I. My first thought wasn't fear. It was a desperate, burning need. I had to know. After 19 years of staring at shadows on a screen, the source was just a few yards away. This was the moment my entire life had been building toward. But I didn't grab a flashlight. I didn't run to the window. My instincts as an archivist, as someone who deals with volatile data, took over. You don't approach a security breach with all systems blazing. You cut the power, you go dark. I reached under my desk and hit the main power switch to my entire office setup. The hum died. The monitors went black. The fortress went silent, plunging me into total darkness and a silence that was now truly complete. I didn't find it that night. I stood on my deck for what felt like an hour, listening to the void, my eyes straining against the darkness. Nothing. Eventually, the sounds of the night cautiously returned. I went back inside, my mind racing, convincing myself I had imagined it, that it was stress. But in the morning, I saw it. On the wooden top rail of my deck, just where the steps lead down toward the forest. 3 long, parallel gouges dug deep into the wood. They were splintered and fresh. It wasn't an attack, it was a mark. A signature, an invitation left at my door. The pact hadn't been spoken. It had been coded. And my obsession was about to become a ritual. This is the beginning of the real story. The one that never made it to the forums. If you've made it this far, thank you. It means a lot that you're listening. Please, if you find any value in this warning, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And please, stay until the end. You need to hear what came next. Those 3 gouges in the wood were not a threat. I see that now. They were a question mark carved into my world. For the first time in 19 years, the data was looking back at me. The silence in my office, once my shield, now felt like a vacuum waiting to be filled. I couldn't go back to just archiving. The librarian had been invited into the book. That afternoon, I went into the attic and found it. A small, wind-up music box, its paint chipped, that had belonged to my sister as a child. It was one of the first items ever associated with the law, mentioned in a terrified, rambling post from 2006 by a woman whose daughter had vanished. I held the cold, metallic object in my hand. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with the history I had spent my life cataloging. It was no longer an abstract piece of data. It was an offering. That night, as dusk painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, I walked to the edge of the deck and placed the music box on the top step, right beside the fresh scars in the wood. It was a test, a prayer to a god I had built out of static and whispers. Waiting was the hardest part. I sat in my darkened living room, staring at the spot where the music box sat. A tiny, man-made thing against the vast, breathing darkness of the Dayshoot forest. Every familiar sound was now amplified, distorted by my anticipation. The creak of the house settling was it, moving on the deck. The rustle of a branch was its long fingers, reaching. I was a scientist waiting for a particle to appear in a supercollider, a theologian waiting for a sign. The line between rational inquiry and madness felt thinner than a spider's thread. What if a raccoon just took it? What if I found it smashed in the yard tomorrow? The thought was almost as terrifying as the alternative. Not because it would prove me wrong, but because it would mean I was alone again, left with nothing but the hum of my machines and the echo of my own obsession. The possibility of contact was frightening, but the return to silence was unbearable. The hum of the servers wasn't enough anymore. I needed a response. I needed to know the silence was listening. The next morning, I woke before the sun, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I couldn't bring myself to look right away. I made coffee. My hands shaking so badly, I spilled grounds all over the counter. I went through the motions of my morning routine, a futile attempt to pretend this day was like any other. Finally, with the first weak light of dawn filtering through the trees, I forced myself to the glass door of the deck. The music box was gone. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I felt a wave of dizzying triumph, quickly followed by a cold spike of fear. It was real. It had answered. But the true shock came when I saw what it had left in its place. Where the music box had been, there was now a small, meticulous arrangement on the wooden step. It was made of tiny twigs, pebbles, and a few desiccated leaves. They weren't just piled there. They were laid out in a distinct, deliberate pattern. It was a diagram, a schematic, and with a jolt that ran through me like an electric current, I recognized it. It was a perfect, primitive replica of a logic gate diagram. An and gate, specifically. 2 inputs, 1 output, the kind of basic building block of digital circuitry I had been staring at for hours the day before, troubleshooting a complex network issue for my day job. The connection was impossible, undeniable, and utterly terrifying. This wasn't a beast. It wasn't some mindless cryptid from folklore, drawn to shiny objects. It was intelligent. It was watching me. Not just my comings and goings from the house, but my work, my life, my thoughts. It had seen the diagrams on my monitor through the window, or it had somehow plucked the image from my mind. The implications were staggering. My carefully curated archive of a monster was obsolete. I wasn't dealing with a simple predator. I was in communication with something that understood the very language of logic and systems that formed the bedrock of my entire life. The hum of the servers in the basement suddenly felt like a conversation I was only now beginning to understand. From that single exchange, the rules of the pact became clear, written in a language of action and boundary. The exchange always happened at the threshold. It never came fully onto the deck. I never stepped off it. The top step was the neutral ground, the airlock between our two worlds. All exchanges happened under the cloak of twilight. A transaction between the world of day and the world of night. I leave something. It leaves something. A perfect, symmetrical trade. It was a system, and I, a systems analyst by nature and by trade, understood it implicitly. A new mantra began to form in my mind. A rule that felt as fundamental as gravity. The line must hold. The integrity of the system, the safety of the pact, depended on that boundary. It was the one piece of the protocol I knew I could never, ever violate. The deck was my domain. The forest was its and. As long as the line held, the communication could continue. My fortress had found its counterpart, and a bridge was being built between them. The addiction took hold immediately. The thirst for the next data point was all-consuming. 2 days later, I tested the system again. I found the tarnished silver locket I'd read about in the mariner's log entry. A piece of law that supposedly dated back to the 1880s. I bought it from an online antique dealer months ago. Just another piece for the collection. Now, it was a key. That evening, I placed it on the step. The act felt sacred. A ritual passed down, not through generations of people, but through generations of data. I was participating in the very myth I had only ever observed. I wasn't just reading the story. I was living it, feeding it. The weight was different this time. It wasn't filled with doubt, but with a tense, almost joyous anticipation. Like waiting for a reply from a lover. The hum of the servers was no longer a wall to keep the world out. It was the engine powering this strange new connection. and I was its willing operator, feeding it tokens of a forgotten world to see what it would generate in return. The response was faster this time. By morning, the locket was gone. In its place was another arrangement of natural materials. This one was more complex, more intricate. It wasn't a simple logic gate. It was a branching structure of twigs and stones that perfectly mirrored the data flowchart I had been designing for a new client project. It mapped the flow of information from a user input through various validation checks and into a database. It was my work, my intellectual labor, reflected back at me in sticks and stones. The message was chillingly clear. I see you. I see what you build. It was learning me, my patterns of thought, the very architecture of my mind. It was no longer just mimicking what it saw on a screen. It was demonstrating an understanding of the concepts themselves. It was processing my world and showing me the output. Every exchange was pulling me deeper, making the world outside my property feel increasingly irrelevant and pale in comparison to this silent, terrifying, brilliant correspondence. A new theory began to form in my mind, a hypothesis that connected my two lives, the archivist and the communicator. What if the creature wasn't just responding to the physical objects? What if the true call was digital? The original stories, the forum posts, the collective belief, that was its genesis. My archive was its sanctuary. So, what if my actions within that digital space were the real stimulus? It was a dangerous idea, but the logic was intoxicating. I logged into a ghost account on a long-dead paranormal forum, a digital graveyard I kept bookmarked for its historical value. I navigated to a thread from 2009. There, I posted a single, cryptic sentence, a quote from an alleged witness account that I knew had been deleted from every other corner of the internet. It was a deep cut, a piece of information that only I, the librarian, would know still existed. I hit post, and the signal went out into the ether, a digital flare fired into the darkness of the web. That night, the response was unlike anything before. It wasn't a quiet exchange of objects. It was a manifestation. I was in my office when my motion alert system pinged my phone. I had set up 3 trail cams at the edge of the woods weeks ago, more out of habit than hope. Now, one of them had triggered. I opened the live feed, my hand trembling. The video was grainy, shot in infrared. For a few seconds, there was nothing but trees. Then, something moved at the edge of the frame. It was fast, a blur of pale white against the dark trunks. The camera struggled to focus, but for a split second, maybe 4 or 5 frames, it was clear. A chalk-white, impossibly long leg, bent at an unnatural angle. A gaunt, skeletal arm, ending in 3 long, spider-like fingers that dug into the bark of a pine tree. Then it was gone. It was a direct, physical response to my digital action. I had posted the data, and the data had walked out of the woods. I wasn't just in communication with it. I was summoning it. A dizzying sense of power washed over me, so potent it almost made me sick. I could control it. My life's work, my obsessive, lonely curation of forgotten data, was not a passive activity. It was an incantation. Each archived file, each restored post, each cross-referenced testimony was a brick in the house I had built for it. And now I had found the doorbell. I could post a forgotten whisper online, and the whisper would gain substance in my backyard. The feeling was more profound, more real, than any human connection I had ever had. Sarah's parting words echoed in my mind that I was more in love with the shadows on my screen. She was right. But she could never have imagined that the shadows would one day love me back. The guilt of that thought was a dull, distant ache, easily drowned out by the thrilling, terrifying hum of this new reality. I was no longer just the archivist of the Rake. I was its partner, its anchor. The ultimate test came a week later. I decided to offer it something that was purely of my world, a bridge between its nascent understanding of my work and the physical reality of it. I took a rare, out-of-print textbook from my shelf, Early Network Protocols and the ARPANET. It was a heavy, dense book, filled with the foundational architecture of the internet itself. It was, in a way, the creature's Bible, the Genesis story of the digital ocean in which it was born. This wasn't a trinket from the lore. This was a piece of me, a part of my own history and expertise. It was a deeply personal offering, a test to see if it could understand, not just a simple diagram, but the complex system behind it. I placed the heavy volume on the step at dusk, the offering feeling more significant than any before. I wasn't just giving it an object. I was giving it a piece of my own soul, bound in hardcover. The next morning, the book was gone. In its place, on the center of the step, lay a single, perfect raven feather. It was glossy black, untouched by the morning dew, shimmering with iridescent blues and purples in the early light. The simplicity and elegance of it struck me silent. This was different from the crude diagrams of sticks and stones. This wasn't a mimicry of my work. This felt symbolic, a communication on a higher level. In my world, in the world of data and networks, a raven feather had no value. It was random, organic noise. But in this new syntax we were building, it felt like a period at the end of a sentence. It felt like acknowledgement, an acceptance, a fair trade. The previous exchanges were conversations. This felt like a covenant. It was a gift, a token that transcended the simple logic of call and response, and entered the realm of mutual respect. It was beautiful, and it terrified me to my very core. The intimacy of that raven feather was a turning point. This secret was too fragile, too important to risk. The small online communities I still lurked in. The handful of old contacts from the forum days, they were no longer colleagues in a shared interest. They were liabilities. They were noise that could corrupt the signal. That afternoon, I began the purge. I methodically went through every account, every profile, every saved bookmark related to my obsession. I deleted my posts, wiped my comment histories, and sent requests for account deletion, citing privacy concerns. I burned every digital bridge I had ever built to the outside world of believers and researchers. The process was cold and methodical, like sanitizing a hard drive. With every click, the fortress I had built around myself grew taller and more impenetrable. I was sealing myself in, ensuring that the only two parties in this conversation were me and the thing in the woods. The librarian was burning his own library, leaving only one book open. By the end of the week, I was completely alone, and I had never felt less lonely. The isolation was no longer a symptom of my grief. It was a necessary component of the ritual. My life now had a singular, driving purpose. My days were spent at my job, gathering the intellectual fuel, the diagrams, and the logic. My nights were spent feeding it to the entity at the edge of my property. The call and the response. The digital post and the fleeting glimpse on a trail cam. The offerings on the step and the cryptic, beautiful replies. It was a closed loop, a perfect system. The hum of the servers was the rhythm of its heart, and the silence of the forest was the sound of it listening. The pact was sealed. The line was holding. My obsession had become a sacred, terrifying communion, a routine that had finally, completely, filled the crushing silence that Sarah had left behind. I had my purpose. I had my connection. The addiction was absolute. The months that followed were a blur of escalating intimacy, a descent into a new kind of normal. The exchanges on the step became the fixed points around which my life revolved. My day job felt like a dream, a necessary but hollow series of tasks I performed to gather more data, more schematics, more complex ideas to offer up at dusk. I was living a double life, but unlike spies in stories, my two worlds were beginning to bleed into one another in terrifying ways. The raven feather sat on my desk, a dark, silent testament to the covenant. It was no longer just about information. It was about connection. And the creature, in its profound and alien way, began to prove it, understood that. It started with the whispers, faint and fleeting at the edge of hearing. They were a new development, a change in the protocol, and they shook me more than any physical manifestation. The line between our worlds was becoming permeable to sound. It happened on a Tuesday night. I was working late, staring at a screen full of code. The hum of the servers, a familiar lullaby. A storm was rolling in, the wind sighing through the pines. And carried on that wind, I heard it. A single word, faint but clear, whispered from the darkness beyond the glass. Mark. It was Sarah's voice, the exact pitch. The same gentle inflection she used to use when she'd find me lost in my work at 3 a.m. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. My heart hammered against my ribs. I told myself it was the wind, a trick of the mind, my own grief playing itself back to me. But I knew with a certainty that defied all logic that it wasn't. It had taken a memory from me, a piece of my deepest sorrow, and given it a voice. It was no longer just reflecting my work. It was reflecting my soul, and it was using my deepest wounds to speak to me. The gifts started to change, they became mirrors of my internal state, offerings that reflected my emotional weather with horrifying accuracy. One afternoon, after a brutal conference call that left me feeling hollowed out and useless, I found a small, dead songbird laid carefully on the step. Its body was perfect, its wings folded as if in sleep. But it was cold and stiff. There was no sign of violence, no torn feathers. It was simply a symbol of extinguished life, a perfect reflection of the despair I felt choking me. The gesture wasn't cruel, it was empathetic. It was the creature saying, asterisk, I see your sadness. Here it is, in a form you can hold, asterisk. The communion was now emotional, a shared language of feeling expressed through these silent, macabre poems left on the threshold between our worlds. The thought was both comforting and profoundly invasive. It knew, and just as it mirrored my despair, it mirrored my joy. A week later, I closed a major deal at work, a small professional victory that left me feeling a rare surge of pride and relief. That evening, I didn't leave an offering, feeling too drained yet content. But in the morning, where the dead bird had once lain, there was a small, vibrant cluster of Indian paintbrush wildflowers, their fiery red petals still glistening with dew. They were flowers that grew deep in the forest, far from my property line. It had ventured out, sought them, and brought them to me as a congratulation. It was celebrating with me. My strange, silent companion in the woods was more attuned to my life than any human had been since Sarah left. My new mantra, my guiding principle, became clearer than ever, protecting the signal from the noise. The signal was this pure, terrifying connection. The noise was everything else. The noise was the entire human world. And then, the noise arrived. It came in the form of two local teenagers, a boy and a girl, whose boredom and bravado led them to the woods behind my house. I first saw them on a Saturday afternoon, cutting through the trees, their loud laughter and shouted conversations a violent intrusion into the careful quiet I cultivated. They were ghost hunting, drawn by the old, persistent rumors about strange lights and sounds in this part of the forest, rumors that I, in my digital past, had helped catalog and keep alive. They were trampling through its sanctuary, my sanctuary, their carelessness a physical threat to the delicate system I had built. I watched from my office window, my hands clenched into fists, a cold, protective anger rising in my chest. They were a contamination. They were a variable I couldn't control, and they had to go. Their presence became a constant source of anxiety. They came back a few times, leaving beer cans and candy wrappers, marking the territory with their mundane disregard. I felt a growing sense of territoriality that was completely irrational. It wasn't my land to protect, not really. But the pact had changed my perspective. The forest behind my home was no longer just the Deschutes National Forest. It was a cathedral, a laboratory, a shared space defined by a sacred boundary. The teenagers and their clumsy intrusions were a desecration. I resisted the urge to go out and yell at them, to scare them off. That would only draw more attention. Instead, I just watched, and I worried. My fear wasn't for their safety. The truth, the ugly and honest truth, is that I was terrified they would scare it away, that their noise would break the connection, and I would be left alone again, with only the hum. The almost disaster happened on a Friday night. I heard them arrive around 10, their voices thick and slurred. They were drunk, and they were trying to be brave, daring each other to go deeper into the woods. I sat in my dark office, listening, my whole body tense. Their shouts were getting closer to the clearing just beyond the tree line. The place I had seen it on the trail cam. "Come on out, you spooky freak," one of them yelled, followed by a peal of drunken laughter. It felt like a personal insult, a violation aimed directly at me and my secret. I could feel a strange pressure building in the air, the same way you can feel the charge before a lightning strike. The normal sounds of the night were fading away, one by one, until only the teenagers' foolish taunts remained, hanging nakedly in a growing, expectant void. Then it came. It wasn't the chittering click. It was a single, piercing shriek that ripped through the night, a sound of pure predatory fury that was utterly inhuman. It was high-pitched, yet it seemed to vibrate right through the walls of the house, through the floorboards, and up my spine. It cut off the teenagers' laughter as if a switch had been thrown. Immediately following the shriek was that silence, that absolute, suffocating, vacuum-like silence I had experienced only once before. It pressed in from all sides, a physical weight that stole the air from my lungs. No crickets, no wind, no distant highway drone, just a profound and terrifying nothing. The silence held for a long, stretched-out minute, and then I heard the frantic crashing of bodies through the undergrowth, moving away from my house, followed by the sound of a car starting and speeding away. My first thought was not relief, it was panic. I had to see what they had left behind, what damage they had done, what proof they might have dropped in their haste. I didn't grab a first aid kit, I grabbed a flashlight. I ran out the back door, my heart pounding, my actions driven by a singular, desperate need to protect the secret. I didn't care if they were hurt. I didn't care if they were terrified. I only cared about what they might have seen, what they might have recorded. My role had been cemented in that moment. I was no longer an observer or even a communicator. I was a guardian, and I was running out into the night, not to help two scared kids, but to erase any evidence that they had ever brushed up against the truth. My allegiance was clear. I was on the monster's side now, completely and irrevocably. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the edge of the woods, where their voices had been loudest. At first, I saw nothing but trampled ferns and a discarded beer can. My shoulders slumped with a tentative relief. Maybe they had just been scared off, leaving nothing behind. But then, a faint light caught my eye. There, lying screen up in the damp soil, was a smartphone. Its screen was cracked, but it was on. The light from my flashlight illuminated it, and I could see the red dot in the corner of the screen. It was still recording. A cold dread, far deeper than the fear of the shriek, washed over me. I knelt down, my hand shaking as I reached for it. This was the noise. This was the contamination I had feared, a digital ghost that could shatter everything. The silence of the forest seemed to mock me as I held the small, glowing device in my palm. I didn't watch it there. I ran back inside, locking the door behind me, and retreated to the sterile safety of my basement office. I plugged the phone into a spare cable, my fingers fumbling, and transferred the video file to my secure server. Only then, in the controlled environment of my digital fortress, did I dare to play it. The video was exactly what you'd expect. Shaky, chaotic footage of dark trees, illuminated by the phone's weak flash, the drunken, boastful voices of the teenagers. Then the shriek, a distorted blast of sound that made the phone's microphone clip into pure static. The phone drops. The view tumbles, showing a chaotic mix of ground and darkness. And then, for a split second, maybe 3 frames, as the phone's light swept upward one last time before settling, it was there. The creature's chalk-white leg, impossibly thin and long, stepping into the frame for a fraction of a second before the video ended in darkness. It was the ultimate proof, and the ultimate threat. It was blurry, it was fleeting, but it was undeniable. It was a digital artifact that could unravel my entire world. My first instinct was primal: delete. Wipe the file, smash the phone. Burn the pieces. But another, colder thought followed. The teenagers were gone. They had screamed. They had run. What if they didn't just run home? What if one of them fell? What if they were hurt, lost? A missing persons report would bring a full-scale search party combing through these woods. They would find the beer cans. They might find the spot. My carefully constructed sanctuary would become a crime scene. I was trapped. Doing nothing was a risk. Telling the truth was impossible. My protection of the signal required me to generate more noise, but of a very specific, controlled kind. I made the choice that has haunted me ever since. I wiped the phone completely, a factory reset, then broke it into several pieces and buried them deep in my trash. Then, using a burner app to mask my number, I made the 911 call. My voice was steady, practiced. I reported hearing teenagers trespassing on my property line, shouting and making a disturbance. I reported hearing a scream, and then the sound of them running off toward the main road. I said I was worried one of them might have been hurt. I gave a location that was roughly correct, but vague enough to be useless. It was a lie, a carefully constructed narrative designed to create an official record that pointed away from the truth. A lie that brought the real world to my door in the form of a sheriff's deputy the next morning. It was the first real price I had to pay. The deputy was professional, bored. He took my statement, shone his flashlight around the edge of the woods, and found nothing. The teens, it turned out, had made it home safely, telling their parents a wild, unbelievable story about a monster that was dismissed as a drunken fantasy. The official report read, "Trespassing youths. Area checked, all clear." The immediate crisis was over. I had protected the secret. The line had held, but something had fundamentally changed. I had lied to the authorities. I had actively covered up evidence of the creature's existence. The fortress was no longer just a place of quiet communion. It was the scene of a cover-up. My role had shifted from partner to accomplice. And as I sat in my silent office that night, the hum of the servers sounding more like a quiet accusation than a comfort, a new question began to haunt my waking thoughts. It was no longer what asterisk it was, but what it was learning from me. The guilt from that lie was a different kind of silence. It was heavy, corrosive. For a week, I barely slept. I kept the lights in the house on, feeble defense against the oppressive quiet of the woods and the louder silence in my own head. My carefully constructed system, my beautiful, logical pact, was now tainted. I was an accomplice. I had chosen the creature over to human beings, and then I had lied to a man with a badge to cover my tracks. Every creak of the floorboards was the deputy returning. Every flicker of the server lights a sign that my digital lies were about to unravel. The hum of the servers, once a comfort, now sounded like a low-grade fever, the sound of a sickness I had willingly invited into my home. The joy of the communion was gone, replaced by the grim weight of consequence. The line had held, but my own moral integrity had shattered, and the pieces were scattered somewhere in the darkness with the broken phone. One night, the loneliness returned with a vengeance, crashing over me in a wave so powerful it felt like drowning. The guilt had hollowed me out, and grief rushed in to fill the void. I found myself in my dark office, not working, just staring at the wall. My hand, moving with a will of its own, opened a drawer and pulled out the one thing I kept from my old life. A small, framed photo of Sarah and me, taken on a hiking trip in the Cascades years ago. We were smiling, squinting into the sun, her arm looped through mine. It was a picture of a man I no longer recognized, a man who lived in the sunlight, a man whose world was bigger than the four walls of a server room. The weight of every choice I had made since she left, every bit of data I had curated, every offering I had placed on the step crashed down on me. I was a man in love with a ghost, and it had cost me everything. The fortress wasn't protecting me, it was my tomb. That's when I heard it. A sound so soft, so out of place, that at first I thought my mind had finally snapped. It wasn't the familiar chittering from the woods, or a whisper on the wind. It was a soft, dry, scratching sound, like a dead leaf, skittering across a pane of glass. It was coming from the window of my basement office, the one that looked out at ground level to a small, overgrown patch of ferns. A breach. The rules were the deck and the tree line, the neutral zone. This was different. This was direct. My heart seized in my chest, a cold knot of terror and something else. Anticipation. I didn't move. I just listened. Scratch, scratch. Pause. It was deliberate. It wasn't an animal. It wanted my attention. Slowly, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to hide, I lifted my head from my hands and turned to face the window, to face the source of the sound that was quietly rewriting all the rules. There, just inches from the glass, was its face. It was the first time I had ever seen it so clearly, so close. The grainy trail cam footage had been a lie, a pale imitation. Its eyes were the most dominant feature, large and luminous, like 2 drops of mercury reflecting the faint glow of my monitor. They held an intelligence that was ancient and unnerving, but utterly devoid of malice. It was just watching me. Its face was gaunt, the skin a chalky, almost translucent white, stretched tight over a delicate, alien bone structure. There was no nose to speak of, just two small slits and a thin, lipless mouth that remained perfectly still. It wasn't menacing. It wasn't threatening. It was simply there, a silent observer in the dark, its strange face framed by the damp ferns outside my window. A visitor from a world of silence, peering into my own. It didn't move. It just looked at me, its glowing eyes seeming to see right through the glass, right through my skin, into the mess of guilt and grief inside me. I couldn't look away, staring into those impossible eyes. The carefully constructed walls of my fortress crumbled to dust. The photo of Sarah was still clutched in my hand. My isolation, my failure, the profound depth of my loneliness all swelled up in my chest until I couldn't breathe. A single hot tear broke free and traced a path down my cheek, a warm line in the cold, sterile air of the office. I didn't bother to wipe it away. What was the point? There was no one here to see. Except there was. As the tear reached my jaw, the creature on the other side of the glass reacted. It tilted its head, a slow, curious gesture, its luminous eyes tracking the path of the tear. Then, it slowly, deliberately, raised one of its long, skeletal hands. The hand was three-fingered, impossibly long and thin, the joints like knots in a piece of old rope. It brought its hand up to the window pane, its movements graceful, unhurried, and utterly silent. My breath caught in my throat. I braced for the impact, for the sound of shattering glass, for the violation I had always feared, but it didn't happen. Instead, its long middle finger gently, so gently, touched the cold glass. It tapped once, a tiny, barely audible, tick, then again, tick, It was a perfect, one-to-one mimicry of a gesture I knew with heartbreaking intimacy. It was the gesture Sarah used to make. She would come into my office late at night, find me lost in my work, and she wouldn't say a word. She would just walk over, lean down, and tap twice on my monitor or the window beside my desk. Tick, tick, It meant, come back to me. You're too far away, It was her silent, loving plea for me to return to the real world. And now, this impossible creature, this thing of myth and static, was making the exact same gesture right over my reflection in the dark glass. It was a gesture of profound, impossible empathy. In that single, silent moment, everything changed. The creature in front of me ceased to be a monster, a cryptid, a data point, or even a partner in a strange ritual. It was a mirror, a perfect, terrifying, beautiful mirror, reflecting my own profound loneliness and grief back at me. It hadn't whispered my pain in Sarah's voice this time. It had shown it to me in her gesture. It had seen me at my lowest, most vulnerable moment, and its response was not to frighten or to take, but to offer a sign of shared understanding. It saw a lonely being trapped behind glass, and it responded in the only way it knew how. Using the language it had learned from my own memories, it reflected my own silence. I wasn't studying it anymore. We were two solitary beings, staring at each other across an impossible divide, finally speaking the same language, the language of being alone. A profound, aching sense of peace washed over me, quieting the guilt and the fear. I was not alone after that night. I didn't see it for nearly a week. The scratching at the window did not repeat. The intimacy of that moment seemed to demand a period of silence, of recalibration. When the exchanges on the step resumed, the protocol had changed. The gifts were different. The natural world was gone, replaced by something else entirely. The first new offering appeared on a misty morning. Where I might have once found a feather or a flower, I now found a small, rectangular object. Green and covered in tiny black squares and silver lines. It was a stick of ram, but it was an ancient model, corroded and flecked with dirt, as if it had been buried for decades. I recognized the form factor from the late 90s. It was a piece of obsolete technology, a fossil from the digital Stone Age. This wasn't a mimicry of a diagram. This was a physical artifact from the world of machines. The conversation had shifted. It was no longer about what I was thinking. It was about where it had come from. The clues kept coming, each one a piece of a puzzle I was becoming desperate to solve. A few nights later, in exchange for a book on quantum computing I had left out, I found a small, tightly wound spool. It was a strip of microfilm, the kind used for archival storage before everything went digital. It was brittle with age, and holding it felt like holding a dead insect. I had no way to view what was on it, but I knew the medium itself was the message. A corroded memory chip, and now a roll of microfilm. These weren't random objects. They were pieces of a technological history. They were ghosts of data, physical remnants of information systems that had long since been abandoned. The trail of breadcrumbs was no longer leading me into the heart of folklore, but into the dusty, forgotten basements of a high-tech past. The entity in the woods wasn't a spirit of nature. It was a ghost from a machine. The final clue from that period was the one that broke everything open. It was the most complex and specific object it had ever left. It was a faded, plastic ID badge, warped and yellowed by time and exposure to the elements. Most of the text was unreadable, but a logo was partially visible: an eagle, clutching a bundle of lightning bolts, long with a few letters of a corporate name. I spent 2 days in my office cross-referencing the logo with archives of government contractors. I finally found it. The badge was from a company called Ethelred Microsystems, a DARPA subcontractor that specialized in network security and, according to a few heavily redacted documents, mimetic warfare. They went bankrupt and vanished in 1998. The pieces clicked into place with a terrifying finality. This wasn't a myth that spontaneously arose on the internet in 2005. Its origins were older, manufactured, and tied to the highest, most secretive levels of the US government. My entire 19-year obsession had been a lie. Or, not a lie, but a misinterpretation of the evidence. I wasn't documenting a cryptid that had been co-opted by the internet. I was documenting the ghost of a secret military project that had escaped into it. The folklore, the sightings, the fire, it was all real, but the cause was not supernatural. It was technological, man-made. The creature in my woods was not a monster. It was an artifact. It was a piece of lost, living data. My role changed once again. I was no longer its partner or its accomplice. I was its historian, perhaps its only hope. It wasn't just leaving me gifts. It was leaving me evidence. It was asking for help. It was showing me the pieces of its own murder, of its own genesis, hoping that I, the archivist, the man who understood systems, could put its story back together. The real investigation was just beginning. This is where the story turns from a personal haunting to something much bigger and much more dangerous. I promise you, the truth is more terrifying than any monster. Thank you for staying with me. Your attention is the only thing that gives this warning any power. If you are finding any meaning in this, please show your support by leaving a like, subscribing to the channel for what comes next, and sharing this story. And you have to stay until the end. You need to understand what they created, and what I did. The outside world finally breached my fortress, not with a bang, but with a quiet, bureaucratic click. It began subtly, as all true systems of control do. An unfamiliar white van, the kind used by cable companies, parked for 2 days at the bend in the road a quarter-mile from my driveway. It had no logo. When I called the phone company to ask about line maintenance, the operator sounded confused. There was no work scheduled for my area. The same day, I started hearing a faint, almost imperceptible echo of my own voice on my landline, a classic sign of a wiretap. These were small things, anomalies in the system. But after months of communicating with an intelligence that spoke in patterns, I had become hypersensitive to any disruption in the expected flow. The hum of my servers, once a comfort, now felt like bait on a hook. The silence of the forest was no longer expectant. It was being watched. My sanctuary was being mapped by an unknown adversary, and the walls I had built were about to become a cage. They arrived on a Wednesday morning, breaking the sacred quiet of my routine. A sensible sedan, a 4-door that was the color of dust, pulled silently up my gravel driveway. 2 people got out, a man and a woman, dressed in plain, forgettable clothes slacks and neutral-colored jackets. They looked like insurance adjusters or county assessors. They didn't have the swagger of law enforcement or the tension of spooks. They were simply professional. The woman was older, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The state of my roof, the trail cams at the edge of the woods, the slight tremor in my hand as I opened the door. The man was younger. Standing slightly behind her, his gaze fixed on me, placid but unwavering. They didn't flash badges immediately. They just stood there on my porch, a calm, disarming presence that was more threatening than any weapon. They were the noise, and they had found the signal. "My name is Mark," the woman said, holding up an ID card. "This is David. We're with the FCC. We're investigating a complaint about severe signal interference in this sector. May we come in?" The lie was perfect in its mundanity. Signal interference. It was a plausible reason to be at my door, given the server farm humming in my basement. I let them in, my mind racing, playing out a dozen different scenarios. I was a systems analyst, and this was an unscheduled systems audit of my life. I led them to the living room, the whole time feeling the woman's eyes, scanning every book on my shelves, every framed photo, every piece of dust. Their questions started exactly as I expected they would. They asked about my server farm, my bandwidth usage, my power consumption. The man, David, took out a small tablet and began taking notes, his questions precise and technical. "What's your typical upstream data rate? Are you running any non-standard protocols? Have you noticed any degradation in cellular service?" It was a masterful performance. They were building a profile, establishing a baseline, using the language of my own world to disarm me. I answered them honestly, my voice steady. It was just a technical conversation. But I knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in my stomach, that they hadn't driven all the way out here to talk about my internet speed. The pivot, when it came, was so smooth I almost missed it. The woman, who had been quietly observing, folded her hands in her lap. "Your setup is extensive for a private residence, Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice calm and even. "Almost an enterprise-level operation. Your ISP records show you have a deep interest in data preservation. Specifically, what our internal terminology calls digital folklore and mimetic propagation." There it was. The language shifted from engineering to something else, something academic and cold. Mimetic propagation. They weren't talking about a monster. They were talking about an idea, a virus of the mind. David looked up from his tablet, his placid expression unchanged. "We're particularly interested in your archival activities related to a specific mimetic entity that originated on a paranormal discussion board in 2005. They didn't say the name. They didn't have to. The air in the room grew thin. The hum of the servers from the basement suddenly sounded like a confession. They weren't hunting a monster. They were auditing my obsession. "We aren't here to shut you down, Mark," the woman continued, using my first name, a casual intimacy that was more unnerving than a threat. "We're here because you've created a problem. A unique problem." She leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes locking onto mine. "For 19 years, you've been more than an archivist. You've been a curator, a gardener. You've gathered every scattered seed of this idea, and you've planted them all in one place. You've weeded out the noise, protected the signal. You've built the most complete, centralized, and potent repository for this thought form in the world." Thought form, the word hung in the air, heavy and clinical. She was describing my life's work, my sacred communion, as if it were a data spill, a containment breach. The horror of it was that she was right. I hadn't just documented the ghost story. I had consolidated its power, focused its energy, given it a home. And now, the landlords were at the door, holding an eviction notice. My secret was not a secret at all. It was a file in their system. They explained it to me not as a monster hunt, but as a data quarantine. They weren't from the FCC. They were part of a clandestine interagency group. Their job wasn't to hunt cryptids, but to monitor and neutralize what they called egregores, a term I knew from my deepest dives into occult lore. Thought forms that, through focused, collective, and sustained belief, could achieve a form of physical or quasi-physical manifestation. The Rake, she explained, was the most successful and dangerous one they'd ever tracked, a mimetic plague that had achieved a terrifying level of persistence. And my home, my server farm, my obsessive, centralized archive. It had become its anchor point to our reality. I was the master key. I was the server admin for a ghost. My paranoia became a suffocating prison. The hum of the servers now sounded like a countdown. Every flicker of the lights, every rustle in the trees, was no longer it. It was them. The communion was over. The pact was broken, not by me or by the creature, but by the intrusion of this new, overwhelming reality. I couldn't go to the deck at dusk. I couldn't leave offerings. The trail cams I had set up felt like they were now watching me. Were there other cameras in the trees now? Microphones. Was the woman's team out there right now, in the dark, watching my home, watching the tree line, waiting? The line I had so carefully maintained, the boundary between my world and its, had been compromised. I felt a surge of protective fear, not for myself, but for it. It was tethered to me, to this place. Was it aware of this new threat? Could it sense the surveillance? Was it trapped here because of me? My obsession, once a source of secret joy, had become a trap. And I had led this strange, lonely being right into it. I had turned my partner into a prisoner, my cathedral into a target. The weight of that guilt was heavier than any lie I had ever told. Their true goal was the most horrifying part. They didn't want to kill it. You don't kill a piece of data with a bullet. You delete it. We don't want to destroy the asset. Mark, the man, David, said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. We want to decommission it. We have protocols for wiping a memetic entity from the network. But this one has you. Your archive is its primary host. It's using your infrastructure, your energy, your focus, as a GPU, to render itself into the world. He looked at me as if I were a piece of faulty hardware. We need your cooperation. We need your archive. We need you to help us pull the plug. They wanted me to willingly participate in the erasure of the being that had mirrored my soul, that had shown me a form of empathy more profound than any I had known in years. They wanted me to burn my own library, not just to hide it, but to salt the earth so nothing could ever grow there again. The paranoia was a physical thing, a constant pressure behind my eyes. I felt their presence everywhere. The white van was gone, but I knew they were still there. In the silence between the hum of the servers, I imagined I could hear the faint whisper of their surveillance. I stopped sleeping. I sat in my office, watching my own security feeds, watching for them, watching for it. But the woods remained silent. The step on the deck remained empty. It knew. It was hiding, or it had been scared away, or it was waiting. My home, my fortress, had become a battleground. It was no longer about a man and a monster. It was about a man caught between a ghost he had helped create and a machine that wanted to erase it. The scale of the fight had become too large. I was just a man with a server farm and a secret, and they were a shadow arm of the government, armed with a vocabulary that could pathologize a soul and a technology that could delete it. They left me with an ultimatum, delivered with the same calm, professional demeanor. You're at the center of this, Mark, the woman said as they stood at my door, ready to leave. You can be an asset, or you can be an obstacle. Help us contain this leak, and we can help you get back to a normal life. Obstruct us, and you become part of the problem we need to solve. The threat was unspoken but absolute. My life's work, my home, my freedom, it was all on the table. They got in their dusty sedan and drove away, leaving me alone in a silence that was more terrifying than any scream. I was standing in the ruins of my own making, faced with an impossible choice: betray the only connection that had made my lonely life bearable, or stand against a force that could erase us both with a few lines of code. The end was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability, barreling down on me like a freight train in the dark. The end came last night, just as I knew it would. I didn't wait for them to knock. As the faint crunch of tires on my gravel driveway reached my ears, a sound I had been dreading for days, I didn't run, I didn't hide. I walked, calmly and deliberately, down the stairs to my basement office, down into the heart of the machine. The hum of the servers was a frantic, high-pitched whine, the fans spinning at maximum RPM, as if in a fever, and it was there. It was crouched in the narrow space between the main server rack and the concrete wall, its pale form looking almost translucent under the frantic blinking of the network LEDs. It wasn't frightened. It wasn't hiding. Its luminous eyes were fixed on me, and in their mercury depths, I saw a terrifying, absolute calm. It was waiting for me. The air was thick with the scent of hot electronics and ozone, and something else. The dry, dusty smell of an ancient, forgotten place. My fortress had become its final staging ground, and the last act was about to begin. Not in the woods, but here, in the cold, humming womb, where it was truly born. It moved, not with the startling speed I'd seen on the trail cam, but with a slow, deliberate grace that was infinitely more unsettling. It unfolded itself from its crouch, its limbs extending to an impossible length, yet it made no sound. It raised one skeletal, three-fingered hand and pointed. The gesture was precise, unequivocal. First, its long finger aimed directly at the main server rack, the glowing, humming heart of my entire operation, the physical architecture of my obsession. Then, it turned its hand and pointed at my central monitor, which was still displaying the page I had been staring at for hours. The original, archived forum thread from 2005. The digital genesis, the first whisper that started it all. And finally, its hand swiveled slowly, terribly, until its finger was pointed directly at my heart. It held the gesture for a long, silent moment, a trinity of accusation and revelation. The body, the word, and the creator. And in that silence, I finally understood. The truth was not in a government file, or a piece of forgotten folklore. It was in me. It let out a sound then. Not the shriek of fury from the woods, but the low, wet, chittering click I had first heard through my headphones. The sound of reply. The sound of acknowledgement. And in that instant, the terrible, beautiful truth paid off with the force of a physical blow. I didn't find the ghost. I had built its house. The Ethelred project had created the seed, a piece of code, a digital ghost left to wander the nascent web. But it was dormant, a whisper without a voice. It was my grief, my obsessive focus, my 19 years of lonely, meticulous curation that had acted as a lens, gathering all the scattered light of collective fear and belief and focusing it into a single white-hot point. My server farm was its heart. My archive was its mind. My loneliness was its soul. I was the GPU, rendering it into reality, just as they had said. I had taken a collective nightmare, given it a name, a history, and a home. And the rent had finally come due, payable in a currency of broken reality and unbearable truth. The heavy thud of a breaching ram against my basement door shattered the moment. It was a crude, brutal sound in my world of silent data. The door splintered and flew open. Two figures, not the calm adjusters from before, but men clad in black tactical gear with no insignia, flooded into the room. They weren't carrying firearms. They held strange, complex devices that whirred and glowed with a faint blue light. Their lenses aimed not at me, but at the space where the creature stood. They saw it. For a fraction of a second, I saw the shock, the clinical surprise in their body language. They had seen the data, but they had never stood in the room with the source code made flesh. One of them raised his device, and a high-frequency tone, just at the edge of my hearing, filled the room. The blinking lights on the servers began to flicker and die, one by one, as if a virus was sweeping through the network. They weren't just here to wipe my data. They were here to capture it, to hijack the signal for themselves. In that split second, as they raised their weapons and the hum of my life's work faltered under their assault, I made my choice. It wasn't a choice for humanity, or for the secret, or even for myself. It was a choice for Sarah. It was for the man in the photograph, the man who knew the sun. It was an act of mercy for the lonely thing I had trapped here, and an act of rebellion against the men who saw it as nothing more than an asset to be stripped. My allegiance was not to them, and it was no longer to the ghost. It was to the silence that came before. I lunged past them, ignoring the hands that tried to grab me, and slammed my palm down on the big, red emergency power-off button on the wall, the one I had installed for fire safety, the one that would sever the entire system from the grid with a final, brutal finality. The room plunged into a deeper darkness, lit only by the blue glow of their devices and the emergency exit sign. But that wasn't enough. It would only cut the power. It wouldn't kill the data. The backup batteries on my main terminal kicked in, the screen flickering to life with a low-power warning. I threw myself into the chair, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard, the familiar clack of the keys, a final, desperate prayer. My hands knew the sequence by heart. It was the kill code, the command I had designed years ago to perform a level 3 cryptographic wipe of every terabyte. To turn my entire digital life into meaningless, unrecoverable noise. It was a suicide switch for my soul. As I typed the final command and hit enter, the agents shouted, a string of acronyms and curses. The servers behind me sparked, a final mournful pop echoing through the sudden silence as the drives were forcibly erased. The hum was gone. The fortress was dead. My 19-year symphony had ended on a single, crashing, silent chord. I had done it. I had burned the library and the librarian to the ground. It was over. As the last of the server lights died and the absolute silence I once feared returned to the room, the creature didn't scream or thrash. It didn't lash out. It simply began to fade. Its form, which had been so solid a moment before, became translucent, like smoke in a cold room. The blue light from the agent's devices passed right through it. It was losing its anchor, its substance, as the data that gave it form was being unwritten from the world. But before it vanished completely, it did one last thing. It stepped forward, its feet making no sound on the concrete floor, and its form flickered like a dying flame. It reached out its long skeletal hand one last time. It didn't reach for me. It reached for my desk, where a small, smooth riverstone I'd picked up on that last hike with Sarah had sat for years, a forgotten paperweight. It picked up the stone, and as it faded completely into nothing, it stepped forward and gently, so gently, placed the cold, smooth stone into my open palm. The agents took me, of course. They were furious, but disciplined. I was hooded, cuffed, and taken to an underground facility that smelled of bleach and concrete. The interrogation was days long. A blur of sterile rooms, bright lights, and calm. Relentless questions from people like the woman who first visited me. They wanted to know about the kill code. They wanted to know if I had backups. They downloaded my brain and found nothing but the ash of my obsession. Finally, they realized the truth. The asset was gone, erased. And the master key, was now just a broken lock. I was no longer useful or a threat. I was just a man who had built a god and then killed it. They released me a week later, a man under perpetual low-level surveillance. Stripped of his technology, his home repossessed and sanitized, his life's work a ghost in his own memory. I was free, and I was more alone than I had ever been in my life. The silence was back, and this time, it was permanent. I live in a small apartment in Portland now. There are no servers, just a single, disconnected laptop I use to look for work. My only souvenir is the stone. I carry it in my pocket every day. It's cold, smooth, weight a constant reminder. Its first gift to me, on the day of the pact, was a diagram of Anne and gate, made of twigs. Its last gift was a stone, input and output. The moral of my story isn't just about the dangers of the internet, or the power of belief. It's that loneliness is a terrifyingly creative force. It's an engine that can build worlds from nothing but grief and static. Our digital universe is a graveyard of hungry ideas, of forgotten ghosts and half-formed dreams. All of them waiting patiently in the dark. Waiting for someone lonely enough, someone sad enough, someone obsessive enough to sit down, to start listening, and to give them a body. I erased my creation, but I can't erase the myth. The signal is out there, and I know, with a chilling certainty that keeps me awake most nights, that somewhere out there, right now, another lonely person is sitting in front of a glowing screen, surrounded by a silence they can no longer bear. They are digging through the digital graveyards, looking for a connection, for a purpose, for something to believe in. They are curating, archiving, and focusing. And soon, very soon, they are going to put on their headphones to isolate a piece of corrupted data. And they are going to hear a strange, chittering sound echo back from the darkness just outside their window. And the cycle will begin again. Thank you for listening to my story, my warning. If this has meant something to you, please, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it. Your attention is what gives these stories power. for good or for ill. Stick around and watch the next video that's about to appear on your screen. There are more ghosts in the machine, and they are waiting to be heard.